This video is the Clash Royale free-to-play tier list. It's basically just a normal tier list, but we're going to be ranking cards in terms of how good they are for free-to-play players. The cards that are going to be in S tier are those that I recommend upgrading, using, and getting evolutions for, and those that are in F tier, you should pretty much avoid entirely. We are going to go through every single card, so without further ado, let's begin. Starting out, we have skeletons, and I think skeletons are going to be a solid A tier. They are a really great cycle card for only one elixir. The evolved form of them is pretty solid as well, and the little Larrys are just overall a super valuable card for one elixir. Next up, we have the bomber, and I'm going to put the bomber in B tier. Bomber is once again a really solid card. Its evolution used to be one of the best in the entire game, but it got nerfed quite a bit. It still is a great evolution though. You can hit tons of stuff with the bomb, and for being a 2 elixir card that does splash damage that can also bait out arrows, that's a lot of value for what you're getting. Next up, we have the goblins, and I'm going to put them in C tier. They're not necessarily bad, but they kind of in a way serve the same role as skeletons, but I think skeletons are better because they have an evolution and they are 1 elixir cheaper. Goblins do have their own use cases in some decks, but just in general, I'm more of a fan of skeletons, alright? Then we have the Goblin Giant. Goblin Giant is okay. I'm gonna put it in C tier. Its evolution is, I honestly think, underrated. I'm a big fan of the evolved Goblin Giant, but just in terms of tanks in the game, I think there's just so many better options to use than the Goblin Giant. Next up, we got Spear Goblins, and I'm going to put them in the A tier. What separates them from the normal Goblins, of course, is the fact that they can target air troops. Spear Goblins are a really solid secondary unit to have in decks for air defense. Like if you're playing Minor Wallbreaker Cycle, Spear Goblins work really well in decks like that. And they are also zap bait as well. So normal goblins don't die to zap, spear goblins do die to zap. So in a way, that actually gives them a little bit more value, I would think. Speaking of zap, that is next up, and I'm going to put the zap at S tier. I mean, straight up, you just can't go wrong with using a zap spell. It's 2 elixir, it's effective, it can reset Inferno Towers, Sparkies, Inferno Dragons, things like that. It has a evolution, which is one of the better evolutions in the game as well. I just can't say anymore. You can't go wrong with having Zap in your deck. I would highly recommend it. Next up, we have another S tier card, and that is going to be the Knight. It's 3 elixir, it's tanky, it has a top 5 evolution in the game. Again, kind of like the Zap, you just kind of can't go wrong with the Knight. It's super versatile, and it can just do so many things in a deck. Next up, we have the Archers, and it's between A and B for me. I'm going to put them at B though. So with the Archers, there's not really anything wrong with them, but kind of similar to the Goblin Giant, there's just other ranged cards for a similar elixir price that just do things better. But if you were to upgrade the Archers, you could definitely have a lot of success with them. Next up, we got regular minions. I'm going to put them in the D tier, to be completely honest. I think minions are pretty underwhelming. We'll go ahead and do the minion horde as well. I think it's D tier. There was a time and place where minions and minion horde were great in the game, but that was like 2017. So it's been quite a while. I'm just not a fan of the minion cards. Next up, we have the Wizard, and Wizard, we're putting it straight in the S tier. Wizard is a very easy card to use. It's pretty easy to upgrade as well. It has a very solid evolution, and it just does a lot of damage that's also splash damage. I'm looking at Royale API right now. Across all of ladder, it is the 15th most used card, and it makes sense. I mean, it's super versatile, and it just works. All right. Then we got the Ram Rider. I'm going to put the Ram Rider in A tier. Now, it is a legendary, so it is a little bit harder to upgrade, but it is one of my personal favorite win conditions in the entire game. If you follow my free-to-play series, you will know that the Ram Rider is my main win condition in that deck, and it has been in that deck for over a year now, and it has never failed me. And it's just an overall really solid card, both on offense and defense as well. That snare can work really well on defense against things like balloons and hog riders if you don't have anything else in cycle. Now we got the arrows. Arrows are going to be another S tier card. It's a similar situation to the Zap. I mean, with arrows, you just can't go wrong with them. There are so many cards in this game that die to arrows that are so popular. I mean, look, just in this list that we have already, we have Spear Goblins, we have Archers, we have Normal Goblins, Minions, Minion Horde, not to mention other cards that we haven't gotten to like the Firecracker. The arrows are probably the best small spell in the game. That's a hot take, but it's the take I'm gonna go with. Next up, we got the cannon. I'm gonna put cannon in C. You really only see it in Hog Cycle, but Hog Cycle is such a predominant deck in the game, especially amongst free-to-play players and mid-ladder players. It's solid. It just got an evolution, which is kind of weird, but also kind of good. I just think there's other buildings that are better, though, that I personally prefer, but, you know, cannon is all right. Speaking of other buildings that are better, we have the Tesla, and I think the Tesla is going to go into the A tier. Honestly, out of all buildings in the game that you could use, I recommend Tesla the most. It's super versatile, targeting air and ground units. It does a lot of damage, and it has an evolution, which is really good. Even though the evolution has gone through quite a few nerfs, and the card itself has gone through quite a few nerfs as well, I still think it's the best building in the game. Another building that is pretty decent is the Mortar. I'm going to put it in the B tier though, mainly because most mortar decks take a higher level of skill because they involve a lot of swarm cards or a lot of cycle cards and things like that. And it's going to be difficult to play mortar decks in places like mid-ladder, where you're going to be playing against a lot of hog riders, a lot of just crazy decks that you've never seen. And in that case, the mortar is going to be difficult. But if you can get good with it, then you can become great and you can defend anything with mortar decks. But until you get to that point, it's a B tier card. Next up, we got Barbarians. I'm going to put them in the C tier. You know, they're okay at what they do. They are a big swarm card. They can deal with tanks effectively. The evolution especially is pretty good, but they are so vulnerable as well to Fireball. And so many people use Fireball that it just kind of makes Barbarians hard to justify using unless you're playing them in a Fireball bait deck. But I'm going to put them in C tier. They're just okay. Tombstone will also put in C tier. It's probably the best spawner in the game, which doesn't really say that much because all spawners in this game are just bad. But yeah, I mean, it works well. It works well paired with Skeleton King and Graveyard and things like that, but it's not really remarkable, so we'll put it in the C tier. Next up, we got Musketeer. We're gonna put her in S tier. Now, the Musketeer did just get an evolution recently, and she's not in S tier because of the evolution, because I honestly think the Evo Musketeer is pretty underwhelming. But dude, just overall, she is just a super versatile card. 4 elixir, ranged, fast fire rate, does a lot of damage, just solid air defense overall. You unlock her in training camp in Arena 1, so you can upgrade her to a high level really early on. Honestly, one of the better cards for free-to-play players in the entire game. And honestly, I'm looking at the next 4 cards that we have, and that exact same memo applies for all of them. We have the Valkyrie, we have the Hog Rider, we have the Mini P.E.K.K.A, and we have the Fireball. All of them being rare cards that you unlock extremely early in the game, and they're just so versatile and so good at what they do. Valkyrie is a solid mini tank that does splash damage. Hog Rider, one of the most reliable win conditions in the entire game. Mini P.E.K.K.A, a very solid tank killer. And Fireball, probably the best big spell in the game. There's a reason why so many people use these cards, and it's just because they're all just so good and reliable. They rarely get balance changes, and they're just very consistent cards that you can put a lot of resources into and not worry about it. And then Valkyrie as well has an evolution, which is pretty good. So all these cards, definitely upgrade them. Next up, we got Fisherman. Fisherman is a close one for me between S and A tier, but I'm gonna put it in A tier because I feel like sometimes mid-ladder and free-to-play players can struggle to use it. Mechanic-wise, it's pretty simple. You place it and it pulls things in, but the timing and the exact tile placement sometimes I think can kind of trick people up a little bit. But I love Fisherman. It's very solid. For 3 elixir, the value you get with this legendary card is unreal. All right, next up we have one of my personal favorite cards to play, and it's Elixir Golem. It's gonna be our first F tier card though, if I'm keeping it real. The main reason is because Elixir Golem is just so vulnerable to splash damaging cards. And in mid-ladder, between like 4,000 and 8,000 trophies, there are so many splash damaging cards. I mean, you notice, look at the S tier. Wizard and Valkyrie alone just absolutely wreck the Elixir Golem. Next up, we got Bomb Tower. I'm gonna put it in C tier. It's okay. I mean, it's good. Does splash damage. It has a bomb that can do damage as well. But again, in terms of defensive buildings, I just think Tesla it's the way to go. Next up, we have the Giant, and we're gonna put it in B tier. Giant has got to be the most boring card in the entire game. But it's also solid. I mean, it is by definition a tank. It targets buildings, it has a lot of health, and it allows your other supporting troops to get to the tower because it absorbs so much damage. And it's solid, but there's definitely better options as well. Next up, we have the Goblin Drill, and I'm going to put it in B tier as well. Goblin Drill is one of those cards that is typically only used by top ladder players, and you see it a lot used in drill cycle decks, kind of up there. You don't see it a lot in mid ladder, which is interesting because I think it's a good card, but it's also a high skill card as well. So that's probably why you don't see it a lot. If you ever have a spare moment though, I would recommend giving Goblin Drill a try. Its evolution as well is pretty good. So I'm gonna put it in B tier. Next up, we have the Electro Dragon. I'm gonna put it in B tier as well. If they did not nerf its evolution, I would put it in A or S tier because its evolution pre-nerf was the most insane thing I've ever seen. Now its evolution is still good and the card itself is still solid, but again, there's better options. Next up, we got Piggies. C tier. Piggies are good. They can do a lot of damage, but this is another one of those cards that is just so susceptible to splash damage. Then we got the Battle Ram. It'll be another C tier card. You don't really see Battle Ram used a lot outside of P.E.K.K.A. Bridge spam. It does have an evolution, but the evolution does leave a lot to be desired as well. It's just kind of mid. Not too much to say for the Battle Ram. Our next card though is not mid, and it is the Firecracker. I see so much Firecracker on my free-to-play account, and I mean, I use it on my free-to-play account as well. I think it was the first card I upgraded to level 15 on my free-to-play account. I mean, it's 3 elixir, it does splash damage, it's super annoying, it's a nuisance, it has a really good evolution that is great at crowd control. For a ranged card, it is hard to do better than the Firecracker. Next up, we have the Inferno Tower, and I'm going to put it in B tier. One of the better tank killers in the entire game, and that's just straight up a fact with the Inferno Tower. But also, there are just so many things in this game that have stuns or abilities to reset. I mean, we have Zap, there's Electro Dragon, there's the newest card, Goblinstein, there's Lightning, there's Electro Wizard. I mean, there are so many things that can counter this card, but even with that being the case, it's a building, it can pull, it can deal with tanks effectively. I think it's still a solid option. One of my favorite cards to play on my main account is the Royal Recruits. Oh, this is kind of tough. I think I'm gonna put them in B tier, mainly because their evolution is so good and so fun. The card themselves, again, that whole splash damage aspect kind of hurts them a bit, but also at the same time, they're pretty low skill and pretty effective at defending both lanes. And in terms of counter pushing, your opponent is gonna have to deal with both lanes. Otherwise, there's gonna be tons of damage. And like I mentioned, their evolution is super fun as well. Personally, one of my favorite cards, definitely my favorite evolution, but B tier is, I think, a good spot. Next up, we got the Mother Witch. I'm gonna put her in D tier. She was good at one point. That was like 2 or 3 years ago. And I mean, for a 4 elixir squishy range troop, there's just better options, man. Now this next one really hurts, and it's the Battle Healer, but I'm gonna put her with the card she synergizes the best with, the Elixir Golem, and I'm gonna put her in F tier. It's kind of interesting, these two synergize so well with each other that when one is S tier, the other is S tier, and vice versa. So I mean, Battle Healer, one of my personal favorite cards because Elixir Golem was one of my favorite decks. I mean, there's just no reason to use her, if I'm just being completely honest. All right, next up we have another instant S tier. It is the Princess Tower troop. Out of all the tower troops in the game, Princess Tower, use it. It is pretty much a guarantee that the Princess Tower will never receive any balance changes. The Princess Tower and its interactions have been the exact same throughout the entire history of the game, and 8, almost 9 years later, I doubt that they would change that. At least I hope they wouldn't. So upgrading your Princess Tower out of all the tower troops is going to be your safest bet. So I'm going to put it in S tier. Also for the S tier cards, I'm going to start putting them on this side just because my face cam is covering up the rest. It doesn't mean that like one card in the S tier is better than the other. So just keep that in mind. But yeah, the next card we're looking at is Golden Knight. I think of all the champions in the game, Golden Knight is probably the worst. I'm going to put it in D tier. It's interesting though, because now that I'm thinking, Golden Knight is not a bad card. But it's just another one of those situations where, why use the Golden Knight when there are so many other better 4 elixir cards that you could use? Speaking of better cards that you could use, we have the ultimate mid-ladder menace card. And it's the Mega Knight. And this is going straight in the S tier. I mean, there is a reason why so many people use the Mega Knight. And it's just because it is a good card. It is a super easy to use card. It has a enter the arena ability. It has a jump ability that is crazy. It does good damage. It does splash damage. It has a really solid evolution as well. And you can really easily build an entire deck around the Mega Knight. You can call it a no skill card. You can call it a bozo card. You can call it whatever. But the Mega Knight is good. And if you are a free-to-play player in this game, you need to be upgrading and using the Mega Knight. 100%. Next up, we have the Goblin Hut. Instant F tier. Don't use any spawner in the game outside of the Tombstone. Just don't. Next up, we got the Phoenix. I'm going to put the Phoenix in the A tier. I think the Phoenix has become underrated. And that's really interesting to think about, because when the Phoenix came out about 2 years ago, it was honestly one of the best cards in the game's history. But then it received like 5 or 6 nerfs that just made it a lot worse. But even then, I still think the Phoenix is a really good card. Solid air defense card, does a lot of damage, and the fact that it has that egg that it drops means that your opponent has to deal with that, otherwise they're going to get a second Phoenix. You don't really hear many people talk about the Phoenix these days, but dude, I think it's a solid card, for real. Next up, we have the Rocket. B tier. It's a good spell. Mainly used in cycle decks, you'll see it. Mainly because those decks are highly defensive, and sometimes you have to rely on Rocket cycling. So I would only recommend it in that sense. If you're not playing a deck where you think you'll have to rely on Rocket cycling to win, then don't use the Rocket. Next up, we have the Dagger Duchess. I'm going to put her in C tier. Now, one thing that's really interesting, I'm looking at Royale API right now. Across all of ladder, the Dagger Duchess is the 13th most used card. And that is just really interesting to me. But the Princess Tower, you should only be using the Princess Tower right now. Dagger Duchess, when she came out, she was great, but she's been nerfed pretty hard since then. And if it were me personally, I would not invest any magic items into the Dagger Duchess anymore. Dude, Princess Tower is just the way to go. Next up, we have another F tier card, the Suspicious Bush. I don't know the purpose that this card serves in the game. I just don't. Next up, we have the Elixir Pump. It's a D tier card. A lot of people use Elixir Pump, and it can provide value in certain decks, especially beatdown decks, where you're kind of banking on making it to double elixir. But even with that case, if you're playing like some sort of giant or golem deck, just have another supporting card in there. I just don't like the Elixir Collector, dude. Now we got Flying Machine. It is basically just a flying musketeer that dies to fireball and is a little bit worse. So I'll put it in B tier. This next one's pretty easy. It's the Barbarian Hut, another F tier. Same deal with the Goblin Hut, just don't use it. And this is another one that really is gonna hurt for me, but it is the Night Witch. She is a D tier card, dude. The only situation you should be playing the Night Witch is with Giant or Golem. And even in those use cases with those decks, those variations of those decks, I still think are pretty underwhelming. My personal favorite card in the game, my woman forever. But dude, she is not doing well. Then we got the Mirror. This one is tough because I see a lot of bozos mirroring their Mega Knights like an absolute idiot. But then there's use cases where the Mirror can be solid. So it really does depend on the player. And because of that, I'm going to put it in C tier. Also, really quick, I'm going to shrink my camera so that way you all can see more as these other spaces fill up. I'm also just going to shrink the tier list entirely. I think that will help as well. Next up, we have Cannon Cart. I think Cannon Cart is super underrated. It is a card, but also a building at the same time. It's a very solid option on defense because of that transforming aspect. And it does pretty good damage, has a decent fire rate as well. It can be hard to find use cases for it on occasion, but if you can somehow find a way to build the Cannon Cart in your deck, it can be a really effective card. Skeleton Barrel, C tier. I mean, there are some scenarios where you can run like a double barrel bait deck, with Goblin Barrel and Skeleton Barrel, and it can be really solid there. It can be solid in clone decks, but most clone decks are cheesy and not like actual decks. It's just kind of there. Next up, we got the Void. If this were like May when the Void was released, I'd put S tier, but it's been nerfed a bunch, and it's just kind of a weird card to get the hang of. It's kind of interesting in terms of what it targets based on its radius and the amount of things it does damage to based on the amount of things within its radius can be kind of confusing as well. So instead of just like memorizing that, why not just have a fireball? You know? Next up, we have the Bandit. I think Bandit is super slept on. I genuinely think it is super slept on. On Royale API right now, it only has a 5% use rate, which is 51st out of all the cards in the game. I would recommend using the Bandit more. Next up, we have Executioner. For free-to-play players, especially, I think Executioner is A tier. If this were just a normal tier list, I'd probably put it C or D tier. But for most of you free-to-play players, which are going to be in the mid-ladder range, I think Executioner is great. Especially when you pair Executioner with Tornado, which we will get to a bit later. This card is just so solid on defense. The splash damage it does is insane. It's incredibly hard to get rid of unless you have like a lightning or a rocket or something like that. And I just really recommend it on defense. I think for mid ladder, it's very slept on. Now this next card right here is the epitome of mid ladder / free to play. And it is the Rage. We're gonna put it B tier. Rage has its use cases. If your Hog Rider gets on the tower and your opponent has nothing else, drop a Rage and the tower will basically be gone. It's also solid in taking out small troops because it does damage. It's a solid small spell, I'm not gonna lie. Next up, we have a Skeleton King, and I'm gonna put my bro in the A tier. He is my personal favorite champion, just in terms of how he works. I just think he's super fun like that. And I also think he's super good, especially if you're gonna play a deck that has a lot of swarms, or if you play against people that have a lot of swarms. A lot of people tend to use cards like Skeleton Army and Goblin Gang and things of that nature. Skeleton King works really great against stuff like that because he does splash damage, and his ability, of course, capturing the souls and basically becoming a walking graveyard. He is really solid like that. So I'm gonna put him in A tier. Next up, we got the Royal Ghost. I'll put him in B tier. Not too much to say. He's good. He can go invisible. He can do splash damage. Yeah. Then we got Skeleton Army. Amongst all of ladder, it is the 9th most used card in the entire game. And I mean, it is just the quintessential swarm card. I'm debating between S and A, but I think I'm gonna put it in S or in A. Just because it is so vulnerable to zap, to arrows, to literally any small spell or anything in this game that does splash damage. But if you can play around those aspects, it is a really good swarm card. Next up, we have the Goblin Barrel, and it is going to be our second win condition in the S tier. Log bait is just such a popular archetype amongst mid-ladder and free-to-play players, and it's understandable why. It's pretty easy conceptually to grasp. Most log bait decks don't have too many legendary cards apart from like Log and Princess, and it's been an effective deck and archetype for years. And all of these decks center around the Goblin Barrel. So upgrading Goblin Barrel definitely is something that you can't go wrong with. Speaking of goblins though, we have a not so great goblin card, the Goblin Demolisher. I want to put it in D tier. I just feel like there's not really a reason to use it. Then we got Electro Spirit. I mean, it does what it does. It can stun. It can take out stuff. It's a good cycle card. It's adequate. It's C tier. Then we got the Monk, and the Monk is really difficult for me to rank because I like the Monk. I think it's very effective. In terms of its effectiveness, especially in this range for most free-to-play players, I think it's very effective. In effectiveness, it would be A or a B tier. But there's one champion on this list that I would just recommend using over the rest of them, even over Skeleton King. So with that being the case, it makes it hard for me to recommend upgrading the Monk at all. So with that, I'm gonna put it in C tier. Now, even with this one champion that I'm gonna get to later, I still vibe hard with the Skeleton King. But just this one champion, I think it's just better than the rest. And like I said, we'll get to it later. Baby Dragon. Dude, Baby Dragon's awesome. It's A tier. It's another one of those cards where it's just kind of like a pillar of consistency It does splash damage, has a decent fire rate. It's pretty tanky. It's been a good card in the game for ages. Next up, we have Freeze. I know a lot of y'all like using Freeze, and I see why. It's a fun card, but it's also pretty gimmicky as well. There are some matchups you're going to be in where Freeze is just going to be useless. And if you do try to use it, it's just 4 elixir down the drain. But there are other matchups where it's like, oh, Freeze won me that game. So it really does depend on matchup. And for that, I put it in C tier. It's just kind of a gimmick. Next up, we have Goblin Cage, which I guess is technically a spawner. So it should go in F tier based on what I said earlier. But it has an evolution, which is good. AKA the Diddy Cage. And for that, I'll bump it up to D tier. Goblin Cage is my personal favorite building to use. But in general, again, for buildings, you gotta go with the Tesla. Next up, we have Skeleton Dragons. I straight up just don't think there's any reason for you to use them. I'm gonna be honest. Next up, we got Electro Giant. I'm gonna put my boy in the A tier. Very low skill, very easy to play, very effective simultaneously. And that is a recipe for a good free-to-play card. Next up, we have the Witch. This one's... Ooh, it's either S or A. Ooh, what should I do? I think I'm gonna put the Witch in S tier. And again, me putting her up here doesn't mean she's better than the rest of these. It just means that I'm putting her there so you can see her. Witch is another one of those cards I've been using on my free-to-play account ever since I unlocked her, and she has never failed me. She does splash damage, she spawns skeletons, which can be awesome on offense and defense, and she's just versatile like that. Baby Goblins is on here. You can't use them anymore. So that's an instant F tier. All right, now that one champion I was talking about that I recommend using, it's gonna be right here. And it's gonna be the Little Prince, and it's gonna be S tier. Little Prince has been nerfed like crazy since it was released last year in 2023. But even with that being the case, I still think it is the best champion in the game for free-to-play players to use. There is one champion that I do think is better. You know what, screw it, we'll just cover it right now. I think the Goblinstein is a better champion. It is a much better champion in the game. I just think Little Prince is just in a better spot in the meta to the point where it won't get nerfed anytime soon. Goblinstein is way too strong. It is going to get nerfed again at some point. I just feel it in my bones. So Goblinstein, I'm still going to put A tier because he's just like that. He's different. But Little Prince, I just think is more versatile. It's 3 elixir. It's ranged, you get another unit with it, and I just feel like what you're getting in terms of the package with the Little Prince is just more versatile and more reliable than what you're getting with the Goblinstein, especially looking long term. Next up, we got Wall Breakers. I shall put them in B tier. Wall Breakers are a good dual win condition when paired with like Miner and other things of the such, and they have an evolution which I think is not the greatest but also underrated at the same time. It's hard to explain. But Wall Breakers are a solid card. Next up, we have the Archer Queen. I'm gonna have to put her in C tier. And again, in terms of champions, Little Prince, Skeleton King, Goblinstein, probably the better ones you should go with. I'm kind of realizing now my logic for champions doesn't really make much sense, so let me just rephrase it to this. For champions in this game, I think there are 3 you should upgrade. There are Little Prince, Skeleton King, and Goblinstein. But in terms of Goblinstein, upgrade it at your own risk, because I think just because of the nature of the card, it makes it that much more volatile to make it more susceptible to nerfs. Next up, we got the Prince. I'm gonna put him in the A tier. The Prince is one of those cards I hate playing against because I know if it charges on my tower and gets a lock, it's basically game over. This thing does so much damage. It's insane. And because of the damage it does, it's great on defense, it's great on offense. A very solid epic card. Another very solid 5 elixir epic card is the Balloon. Balloon is one of the more reliable win conditions in the entire game. If it gets on the tower, it's going to do a lot of damage. Even if it doesn't get a hit, you're still going to get death damage. Not much to say. It's just good like that. Then we got the Giant Skeleton. I will put it in B tier. A very decent defensive card. That bomb it drops can do a lot of work in terms of crowd control. Also, if it gets on the tower, it can do a lot of work right there. Then we also got the Lightning. I'll put it C tier. Lightning again, it's another card. It's okay. I'm running out of things to say for these cards. But we have quite a few more to go, so I'll have to come up with something. Next up, we have our last champion, which is the Mighty Miner. It's going to be another C tier champion. One of my favorite champions. I just think it's really cool how you can switch lanes like that with its bomb. It's decent in terms of being a tank killer. I just think for that niche of card, there's better things to go with. Next up, we have Expo. This one's, it's going to be an F tier. But seriously, with how crazy the decks are that people play in this game that are not top ladder decks, Expo is going to be a struggle for you. If you want to embrace that struggle, by all means, go for it. But you're going to have a hard time. All right, next up, we have another top card in the game, the P.E.K.K.A. P.E.K.K.A is gonna be S tier. She's 7 elixir. She does a crap ton of damage. She has a crap ton of health. She has a very good evolution as well. I mean, dog, P.E.K.K.A is just good. Next up, we have the Golem. I'm gonna put the Golem in C tier. Beatdown as a whole has fallen off a little bit. If this were 2018, 2019, Golem's going straight in A tier. No question about it. And it can still be viable. As a Golem master myself, I, of course, can still have success with it. You may not, because you're just not on my level. Golem is decent, though, for sure. Royal Giant, we're going to be putting in A tier. Very solid overall win condition. It's 6 elixir. You played at the bridge. And it's very hard for it not to get damage, especially with its evolution, which can just clear out any swarms around it. It's a pretty decent win condition that you could invest a lot into. 3 Musketeers, don't use them. Just don't use them. Dark Prince, that's another solid A tier. Dark Prince has always been one of the more versatile cards in the entire game. He has a shield, so he can survive any spell at any point in time. He charges, he does splash damage. Dude, I mean, Dark Prince is just, this is a good card, man. Poison is going to be another S tier. The age-old debate between Poison and Fireball. Fireball is obviously better, but Poison does have its advantages. If you're struggling against the Witch, then the Poison can deal with those skeletons effectively. While I do think Fireball is better, Poison is still very, very good for a 4 elixir spell, and I highly recommend using if you want to change it up from Fireball. Next up, we have the Cannoneer. That's going to go in D tier. Definitely the worst tower troop in the game. Actually, Baby Goblins is the worst because you can't use Baby Goblins. Like I said, the only tower troop you should be using is a Princess Tower. Do not use anything else, please. Speaking of Princess, look who we have. And we're going to put her in A tier. We talked about earlier the viability of log bait over time. Princess is a very important card in log bait decks, and she is a card that has remained good for a while as well. She's one of the safer legendary cards to upgrade, and she will pretty much always have some sort of usability because of her absolutely insane range. Next up, we have Ice Wizard, solid B tier card. The ability to have any slow or any sort of stun or anything that inhibits progression like that is always going to be decent to some extent. And Ice Wizard has that slow ability. So yeah, it's a good card. Goblin Machine, I'm gonna put it in F tier. It was really good for like 48 hours, and then it became really bad. And it has stayed really bad ever since. Next up, we got Fire Spirit. This is another B tier. Not really anything to say. It's a spirit, it does splash damage. Good job. Goblin Curse. I'm gonna put D tier. Goblin Curse is pretty niche in its viability, and you pretty much always have to pair it with something else. Because if you want things to die in it and turn into goblins, the Goblin Curse itself does not do a lot of damage. So you're gonna have to pair it with something else. So it's just an extra 2 elixir on top of something else. And honestly, you could just use something else in your deck that would just be better, to be honest. Next up, we have Furnace, another F tier. Again, it's the whole spawner thing. Don't use them. Guards are a solid B tier. I still recommend Skeleton Army over Guards. They're both 3 elixir skeleton swarms. Guards do have the use cases of surviving spells, which is nice in some situations. I just think Skeleton Army is overall going to be better. Next up, we have the Miner. Miner is going into the S tier. You know the meme nerf Miner? Guess what? They don't do it. They don't nerf Miner. And because of the fact that they don't nerf Miner, it's going to stay good. I mean, it's going to be good. Even if they do nerf Miner, just the fact that you can take this card and you can place it anywhere, it almost guarantees it's going to get damage. And if it doesn't, then your opponent is going to have to respond to it. Because over the course of a match, if you just keep chipping away and play good defense, you're going to win a majority of your games. Sparky, a lot of people use this in mid ladder. I see it a lot, but I just think it's okay. It's funny. There are so many cards in this game that counter Sparky. I mean, it's unreal. Then we got the Lava Hound. I mentioned earlier how I don't really recommend Lava Hound. I don't know. There's just something about it. I can't really put my finger on it. Lava Hound just, it doesn't do it for me. It doesn't do it for me. I know that's very solid justification on my part. Ice Spirit, similar thing to the Fire Spirit, solid. It might be a little bit better because it has an evolution. Although I do think Ice Spirit evolution is the worst evolution in the game. So it's okay. We got Bowler. For free-to-play players, I think Bowler, it's interesting. I'm gonna put it B tier because it is solid at pushing things back, except for tanks and princes. Although because of the fact you're gonna be going up against a lot of hog riders, a lot of ram riders, a lot of witches, a lot of things like that that can be problematic, the Bowler does have its viability. Next up, we have the Log. This is a no-brainer. Log goes into the S tier. Again, it's another one of those small spells like Zap or Arrows where you just cannot go wrong with it. It is good. It can knock back anything in the game. If you played at the bridge, it is guaranteed tower damage, and it's only 2 elixir. Next up, we have the Lumberjack. I'm gonna put it in B tier. It's solid. It's fast. You can catch a lot of people off guard with it because of that. The Lumber Loon combo is pretty solid, not gonna lie. Then we have Ice Golem. I'm gonna put Ice Golem in A tier. It's another one of those cards that's just always been good. 2 elixir, cheap, tanky, has death damage to take out skeletons and things like that. Works really well when paired with Hog Rider, of course, in 2.6 Hog. Mega Minion. This one's interesting. If this were 2018, I would say Mega Minion's A tier. You know, me saying that doesn't matter because it's 2024. I think Mega Minion's D tier. Mega Minion, when it gets up close, it can do decent damage, but it has a pretty slow fire rate. And in terms of air cards that do a lot of damage, there's just better options. Inferno Dragon. This is gonna be another S tier. Now, Inferno Dragon is another one of those cards where it does get countered by anything that resets and stuns, but it's also another one of those cards where it demands a response. It does. And on offense and defense, your tanks are not getting through an Inferno Dragon, and you are absolutely cooked on defense unless you can deal with it. Because of the sheer fact that it demands a response and the fact that it is good at what it does, being a mobile tank killer, I think it deserves the S tier spot. Next up, we got the Graveyard. Graveyard is going A tier. Graveyard can be a much higher skill win condition to play, especially because of all of the splash damaging stuff and swarm stuff that is viable in the game. But pairing a Graveyard with a poison, sometimes pairing a Graveyard with a freeze, it can be really good. And it really always has been good in the game. I can't think of a time where Graveyard has ever been bad, so that kind of makes it a safe bet to upgrade. Elite Barbarians. I know y'all mid-ladder players love your E-Barbs, but I'm gonna put it in B tier. This does not mean that they're bad. E-Barbs have their use cases, all right? But you guys don't play them right. And because you misuse them, they go in the B tier. Next up, we have the Tornado. Tornado is going into the S tier. Tornado, again, another one of those cards. It has never been bad. And that is because of 2 reasons. Number 1, King Tower activations. Pulling a Hog Rider, pulling a Miner, pulling a Royal Ghost. It is so good at doing that. And number 2, it pairs so well with so many cards. Tornado with Wizard, Tornado with Executioner, Tornado with Firecracker. Tornado with really any splash damage card is going to work. And because you see how many cards that do splash damage are good for you to use, really having a Tornado in your deck is almost a must-have, I would argue. Next up, we have Clone. Don't use it. That's an F tier. Next up, we have Electro Wizard. In kind of the pro and competitive scene, you don't see much Electro Wizard anymore. And it's kind of sad to see because across the general game, I still think it is a really good card. In terms of usage rates for all cards, it is number 24 at 12%. And it makes sense why a lot of you use it because it is just solid. It stuns, it targets multiple units, it does a lot of damage, it's only 4 elixir, it's a built-in zap. It's just a great card. Goblin Gang, I'll put a B tier. The one advantage it does have over Skeleton Army is the fact that the Spear Goblins do act as air defense. But in terms of a 3 elixir swarm card, I'm still just gonna recommend Skeleton Army every single time. Dart Goblin, I want to put B tier. Solid card, good range. Next up, we got Bats. This is going to be another S tier card. Bats are the skeletons of the air, except I think they are better because in general, a air cycle card I think has a little bit more value. Also, I think the evolution for the Bats is better than the evolution for the skeletons. That's just a personal opinion. That might be a hot take. I'm not entirely sure. Bats can go well in any deck. On second note, I'm going to move skeletons up to S tier. Even though I do think Bats are better, I do think in general they're kind of on the same playing field. So we're gonna put skeletons there. Heal Spirit. We're gonna F tier. Back in 2020, this thing was good, but that was 4 years ago. I keep reminiscing on the past like I'm retired or something. Bro, I'm 21. Zappies. Another card that used to be good, but just really isn't anymore. Barbarian Barrel is borderline S tier, but I'm going to put it A tier. It's another really good small spell, but I think Log, Zap, and Arrows are just a little bit better. The added value with the Bar Barrel, though, is that you do get that Barbarian, which can provide some good value. All right, we have 5 more cards, ladies and gentlemen. First up, we have the Hunter. Hunter's B tier. It's solid as a tank killer, targets air as well. Has a great mustache. I'm going to put Magic Archer in the B tier as well. It can be cool in terms of lining up things effectively, but that is a mechanic that is a little bit harder to master. With practice, though, it can be done in terms of, you know, lining up things on the tower or just lining up the geometry in general because its splash damage is so small. But if you can do that effectively, it can be a really solid card. But I'll put it in B tier for the masses. Looking at Rascal, we will put it in the C tier. They can be solid in bait decks, but if you're gonna have like a mini tank in bait decks, I would much rather you use a Knight or a Valkyrie. I just think they're better in that situation. Then we got Giant Snowball. That's another C tier. In terms of the small spells, all these other ones are just better. The Giant Snowball does have that knockback and slow factor, which is useful for sure. But just the others are just better. Then we got Earthquake. Earthquake is B tier. It does super well against buildings. It's kind of it though. Really only use Earthquake if you're going to be using Hog Rider or Royal Hogs. Ooh, and then last but not least, we have the Royal Delivery. Royal Delivery I think is underrated. I'm going to put it in B tier. It's like Barbarian Barrel, but also not like Barbarian Barrel at the same time. The timing of it can be a little bit difficult because it does take a while to deploy, but it has a pretty big radius. It does a lot of damage, and you get a Royal Recruit in there as bonus to help out as well. And I think on that note, I've gone over all the cards. There is stuff at the bottom, but it's just the evolved versions of the cards, as well as limited time cards, as well as the heal spell, which doesn't exist anymore. So I think I've gone over every single card. So fully zoomed out, here is what the entire tier list looks like. Feel free to screenshot, feel free to reference for yourself. But again, going back to the beginning of the video, these cards in the S tier are definitely the best of the best. For the most part, they're going to be consistently good cards in the game that I would 100% recommend upgrading. A tier cards, for the most part, you're going to have success with as well. B tier cards are okay for the most part. C tier cards can be good in very niche cases. And then the D and the F tier cards, I would pretty much just ignore entirely. The only one I wouldn't ignore entirely is Night Witch if you do want to play it with Golem. But that's really about it. So I hope you all enjoyed this video. It's a little bit of a different take on a tier list, but I hope you all enjoyed. If you did, leave a like, subscribe. Be sure to watch this video right here. YouTube thinks you'll like it, and I'm sure that you'll like it as well. That's it for this video, and I'll see you all in the next one.